The Bahrain Grand Prix of 2014, in my opinion, is one of Mercedes' best ever victories. And in today's video, we are going to take a look at the data tale behind that and exactly what made it such a good Grand Prix. So without further ado, we will jump on in to the tale in the data of the Bahrain Grand Prix of 2014. And so our story starts with the starting grid of this Grand Prix, and on the front row was Nico Rosberg ahead of Lewis Hamilton, and starting just behind them on row number 2 is Valtteri Bottas and Sergio Perez, all 4 drivers on the used soft tyres. Then comes row 3, which consists of Kimi Räikkönen and Jenson Button. Row number 4 is Felipe Massa and Kevin Magnussen in the McLaren. Row number 5 comes Fernando Alonso and Sebastian Vettel, 2 rivals of the distant past, and then row number 6 is Hülkenberg and Dani Kvyat. Interestingly here already, Sebastian Vettel is the only driver to start on the medium tyres inside the top 10. But moving to the second half of the grid to see how these drivers line up, we've got Daniel Ricciardo starting on a brand new pair of soft compound tyres, just ahead of Jean-Eric Vergne. Then next up we have Esteban Gutierrez, followed by Romain Grosjean in P16, Pastor Maldonado and Kamui Kobayashi as well. Then we've got Jules Bianchi and Marcus Ericsson, both drivers on the soft compound of tyre. And then finally, on the back row of the grid, we have Max Chilton and Adrian Sutil. So the scene is all set for a fantastic 900th Formula 1 Grand Prix. We've got 2 drivers starting on the medium compound of tyres, Sebastian Vettel and Adrian Sutil. We have about half the grid starting on the used soft compound of tyre, and then we have the rest of the drivers on brand new softs. So let's remind ourselves of the Grand Prix results. It was Lewis Hamilton who took the Grand Prix victory ahead of poleman Nico Rosberg. Then there was a gap of 24 seconds back to Sergio Perez on the podium for Force India, with Daniel Ricciardo climbing from P13 to P4, then Hülkenberg, Vettel, the 2 Williams and the 2 Ferraris round out the points. However, there is more to this story than just the starting grid and what tyres people were on and the order that drivers finished in. Let's take a look at the lap time chart, and we can split this up into 4 separate phases. Phase 1 takes a look at laps 1 to 11 just before we get to the first stage of pit stops. Phase number 2 encompasses this first round of pit stops. Phase 3, which technically would have been all the way to the end of the Grand Prix had there not been a safety car, encompasses the second round of pit stops. And then Phase 4 is the sprint to the finish in the last 10 laps. And so the tale of the Bahrain Grand Prix of 2014 begins at phase number 1. And we first take a look at the lap time charts between laps 1 and 11 for phase number 1. We have the slightly darker yellow highlighting the used soft runners, then we have the bright yellow of Nico Hülkenberg highlighting the soft compound tyre runners, and then we have the white highlighting the medium tyre runners of Sebastian Vettel. And the fastest lap time was set by Lewis Hamilton on lap number 4, a 1 minute 40.544. However, his teammate Nico Rosberg set a time just 200ths slower than this on lap number 3. But interestingly, there is no other laps that are in the 1 minute 40s other than the 2 Mercedes in this first opening phase. And averaging out all of these lap times in the first phase, we can see that Nico Rosberg on average is about a 10th slower than Lewis Hamilton. He is slowly opening up a gap. However, if we take a look at the rest of the grid, no one is even within a second. The closest is Felipe Massa, that is at 1.2 seconds on average per lap slower. And we actually get the first pit stop of today's Grand Prix, which is courtesy of Valtteri Bottas on lap number 11. And taking a look at the second half of the grid, we can once again see the fastest lap set here was a 1 minute 41.791. This is well over a second slower than what the Mercedes of Lewis Hamilton managed to set. And again, turning our attention to the average lap times throughout phase number 1, we can see that no one came within 2.3 seconds of the average lap time set by the Mercedes. They are showing enormous pace in the opening phase of this Grand Prix. But delving a bit further on into the data, we can take a look at the individual lap time charts for this Grand Prix and also the individual positional charts for this Grand Prix as well. And the first thing to note is here on lap number 8 of phase number 1, there was a gap of about 1.3 seconds in this gap where the Mercedes were that much quicker than everybody else, which they managed to maintain for about 3 laps if you exclude Valtteri Bottas coming in for his pit stop. We can also highlight 4 individual bands of racing within this Grand Prix. We have the band of just the Mercedes. We have the middle band of the front runners as well, such as the McLarens, Ferraris and Red Bulls. We then have the lower band, such as the Saubers and the Lotuses. And then we have the rear band as well, the back markers, such as the Caterhams and the Marussias. And we can trace this all the way down to the end of the Grand Prix. And like I mentioned just previously, we can see Valtteri Bottas coming in for his pit stop by the top yellow arrow and taking full advantage of his fresh tyres, but not even coming close, not even to within half a second of the Mercedes, who are still on used soft tyres. And much like the lap time tables, we can work out the average lap times for each driver that was set on their particular compound of tyre: the used softs, the new softs, and the mediums. And then we can also map this onto a small bar graph as well, just visually showing the enormous gap that Mercedes has, well over a second per lap in phase number 1. And it's here where the average lap times start to fall apart, as the stints themselves start overlapping the overall phases of the Grand Prix. We can still take average lap times throughout each phase, but it is important to note that different drivers will be on different compounds of tyres, different drivers will be engaging in battles with each other, etc. It's only really important to take the average lap times in sections where people aren't really pitting, or we can compare them against the same compound of tyre. And so we jump on into phase 2 of the Bahrain Grand Prix of 2014, and once again we start with the lap times in the table, and we can see that everybody is now taking their pit stops in phase number 2, getting off of those used soft compound of tyres. Everybody except Valtteri Bottas so far, as he has already pitted. But interestingly, the fastest lap doesn't actually come from a Mercedes. It comes from lap number 18 from Sebastian Vettel, just after he pitted to get off of his medium compound of tyres to go onto a brand new set of shiny softs. However, this was not the first time that there was a lap time under the 1 minute 40s. There was also a multitude of lap times set, with the most coming from the 2 Mercedes as well, but Nico Hülkenberg setting 2 1 minute 39 lap times. However, it's Valtteri Bottas this time who has the fastest average lap time in phase number 2. However, it's important to note that different drivers are on different compounds during this race, so sometimes it is a bit unfair to average out all of these lap times like this. But interestingly, it's Nico Hülkenberg who splits the 2 Mercedes, being on average 0.4 a lap slower than pace setter Valtteri Bottas, whereas Lewis Hamilton over on the far left was just 0.3 a lap slower, and Nico Rosberg was almost 0.6 a lap slower. And then moving to the second half of the grid, we can see that the fastest lap was set by Daniel Ricciardo on lap number 20, a 1 minute 40.383 on the used medium compound of tyre. And he was the only driver in this selection to fall within a second of the pace setter Valtteri Bottas. But once again, taking a look at this section's lap charts and positional charts as well, we can map these on for the 12 laps in phase number 2, and we can see all of the pit stops and all of the positional changes that are happening because of this. So if we take the positions from lap number 11 and we pull up this little leaderboard, it was Hamilton leading Rosberg by 1.4 seconds, then there was a nice healthy 14-second gap back to Felipe Massa and Sergio Perez in P3 and P4. But at the end of phase number 2, it is still Hamilton from Rosberg, but the gap is now 6 seconds, and then comes Valtteri Bottas, who has leapt up all the way from P16 after his pit stop at the end of lap number 11, all the way to P3 above his teammate. Then come the 2 Force Indias, with Button slipping down that order as well. And unfortunately, we are starting to lose the definition in the lap time charts, but we can just about see for the first couple of laps in phase number 2 that there are 2 individual distinct bands of racing. But because of all of the pit stops and everyone going a little bit faster just afterwards, we do lose this definition. However, on the positional chart, we can actually map on Valtteri Bottas' progression as everybody else pits. He took full advantage of that undercut and ended up being P3 at the end. But for Valtteri Bottas, doing that undercut does not always guarantee you will keep those positions by the end of the Grand Prix. You are on older tyres and will end up wearing them out a little bit quicker. But from phase number 2 of the Bahrain Grand Prix of 2014, we head now to phase 3. Now, phase 3 is where teams would start to wind down their engines and sort of focus on getting to the end of the Grand Prix. Phase 3 is normally where we see this happen. However, we did get that safety car at the end of phase number 3, which extended this to a 4-phase race. But as always, starting with the lap time leaderboards, we can see that the fastest lap actually comes from Felipe Massa this time. It has been a while since Mercedes have scored a fastest lap. A 1 minute 39.2 just after Felipe Massa's second pit stop in this Grand Prix on lap number 39. However, averaging out these stints for phase number 3, it is Lewis Hamilton who has the fastest overall lap time on his new soft compound of tyres, with Nico Rosberg being on average 0.4 a lap slower. However, he is on a brand new set of medium compound of tyres, the slower compound. And the Mercedes are the only two cars not to pit in any portion of phase number 3. Compared to everybody else, some drivers are taking 2 pit stops, some drivers are taking 1. And then taking a look at the second half of the grid, we can see that down on lap number 41 that the safety car is called out for an incident with Gutierrez and also Pastor Maldonado. But taking a look at the individual lap charts and the positional charts as well for phase number 3, laps 25 through to 41, we can see a little bit more definition in the lap time charts at the top, as well as a lot of positional changes in the second half of phase number 3. But taking a look at where we left off from phase number 2, it was Hamilton leading Rosberg by 6 seconds, with Bottas 18 behind, having a close train of Massa, the 2 Force Indias, and then also Fernando Alonso just behind. And then at the time of lap number 41, when the safety car is called, it was Lewis Hamilton leading Nico Rosberg by 13 seconds. There was then over a minute to get to Sergio Perez and Nico Hülkenberg, who all took pit stops in phase number 3, but the Mercedes did not. And like I said at the start, we can see this individual bands of racing forming, that the two Mercedes are once again the quickest cars on track by on average 0.8 a second per lap. This lasts until about lap 7 or 8 of phase number 3. And at the very end, we can just sort about see the pace difference where the two Mercedes at that top green arrow are now a little bit slower than everyone, again by about 0.8 a lap to about a second a lap. But it is in phase 3 where this Grand Prix turns on its head. The collision between Pastor Maldonado and Esteban Gutierrez that caused the safety car and the ultimate sprint, the 10-lap sprint to the end, that has become phase 4. And taking a look at the lap time charts for phase number 4, we can see the section of the racing where everyone is behind the safety car from 42 all the way to 46. Everyone is in the 2-minute 20s sort of lap times. Everyone is recharging their batteries. Everyone is conserving their tyres, conserving fuel. There is no reason for no one to not be pushing all the way to the end of the flag. That was a little bit of a tongue twister, but that was not my intention at all. Everyone is sprinting to the end at this Grand Prix. There is no reason for anyone to be driving slowly. And we can see that the fastest lap time of this Grand Prix comes at lap 49 from Nico Rosberg, a 1 minute 37.020, by far and away the fastest lap time ever around this track this Grand Prix. And averaging out the 2 stints of the Mercedes drivers, who are once again on split tyre strategies, Nico Rosberg is just 0.06 of a second slower than Lewis Hamilton on average, and he is on the faster compound of tyre. He couldn't find a way past Lewis Hamilton. And the next closest person to the Mercedes on average lap times, who was also on the same compound of tyre as Lewis Hamilton, was Sergio Perez, and he was on average 2 seconds down on the Mercedes pair. This is absolutely phenomenal pace, and pace that we have not seen since. And just looking a little bit further up on lap 49, Sergio Perez had his fastest lap, a 1 minute 39.8, which was a full 2.8 seconds slower than Nico Rosberg's fastest lap time. And we can also highlight the remaining 1 minute 37 lap times only from the Mercedes pair. No other driver even made it into the 1 minute 38s. The closest they got was the 1 minute 39.8 of Sergio Perez. And then moving to the second half of the grid, we can see that on average it was Daniel Ricciardo that was the only driver in phase number 4 to come within 2 seconds a lap on average of the two Mercedes. And it is phase 4, which is why I regard the Bahrain Grand Prix of 2014 as one of Mercedes' best ever. To be on average 1.9 seconds a lap faster than your next nearest car. That is pace that we have not seen since. And they even held this up at the start of the Grand Prix, progressively through phases 2 and phases 3. When everybody else is pitting around them, they always had the fastest car. And it is this show of strength and show of pace that is just truly, truly astonishing, and something that we have not really seen since the 2014 season. But taking a look now at the lap time charts and the positional charts of phase number 4, we can map this on, and we can clearly visually see the enormous pace difference of the two Mercedes to the rest of the field. But looking at where we left off on lap 47 at the safety car restart, it was Hamilton from Rosberg just 4 tenths, and then there was 4 seconds back to Perez and Hülkenberg, with the two Red Bulls just close behind. And then at the checkered flag, just 10 laps later, it was the two Mercedes, Hamilton from Rosberg, 1 second in it from Perez, who was 24 seconds back. And turning our attention to the lap charts, we can see that on lap number 3 of phase 4, they were 2.8 seconds faster than the next closest car. That is pace that, like I've said, has not been seen since. And even on lap 6 and laps number 7 of phase 4, when the two Mercedes are going wheel for wheel together, they are still the fastest car on track. And there we go, there is the tail in the data of Mercedes' best ever Grand Prix, Bahrain of 2014. Thank you guys so much for watching this new style of video, this Tail in the Data series of the Bahrain Grand Prix of 2014. If there are any other races that you'd like me to consider, please let me know in the comments below. Or perhaps I could look at an entire season going race by race by race in this sort of data fashion. But bear in mind, these do take an extremely long time to make and put together as well. So any recommendations and any ideas and thoughts are much appreciated. So please let me know in the comments below. And also, what did you think of the Bahrain Grand Prix of 2014? Do you think it is one of Mercedes' best ever races? And if not, what do you think now that you have seen the data that I've just presented? But that's all I've got for you today, guys. I hope you have enjoyed, and I will catch you in the next episode with whatever and whenever I decide to make it. I'll see you guys then.